There is a scene in Ulysses where Stephen Dedalus, working as a junior schoolmaster, sits in the study of Deasy, his headmaster. Deasy, who is somewhat sententious, is handing over Daedalus's pay and a homily about money. "But what does Shakespeare say? Put money in thy purse." Daedalus, unheard by Deasy, murmurs in reply, "Iago." It is all too easy to offer up a quotation from Shakespeare as if its provenance is a guarantee of its worth. Daedalus has spotted that it is not necessarily worth trusting the advice of Iago, a malignant, manipulating murderer. Every word of Shakespeare in his plays is actually said by a character, not by the playwright. Shakespeare the man said absolutely nothing. Well, in one sonnet alone, of course, he came up with Summer's Lease and The Darling Buds of May, but aside from providing a title service for novelists the world over, Shakespeare personally offers little in the way of proverbs, axioms, or mottos by which we can live our life. He was an artist, after all, not a philosopher or an advertising copywriter. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian. Today we're talking about Wolfgang Mieder's The Wit of One and the Wisdom of Many, Proverbs as Cultural Signs of Folklore. Wolfgang is a remarkable human being with a list of published works that goes beyond being envied to just being absurd in its breadth and its capaciousness. And he is a Peremiologist, someone who studies Proverbs. And he's at the University of Vermont. And this is he has so much work, but this is a chapter that summarizes basically the state of Proverbs scholarship. It serves as the opening chapter to his book, Behold the Proverbs of People, Proverbial Wisdom in Culture, Literature, and Politics. But it's the best summary of the complexity that is a proverb, and then the multifaceted contexts in which proverbs are used. And he spends a lot of time trying to define it, and he has spent his life trying to define it and see what the state of the state of the art of proverb definition is. So I'm not going to try and encapsulate all of those, but as a working definition, at least for the duration of this video, we can be thinking of a proverb as a piece of conventionalized wisdom. It's conventionalized in two ways. One, it has been rendered into some kind of aesthetically pleasing form. Aesthetic based on the aesthetics of the culture in which it is circulating, although of course it also subsequently, as it becomes a received text, it informs that sense of aesthetics. And conventionalized in terms of, because it is repeated, because it has gone through processes of being woven into the system of folk ideas, it becomes a commonplace. It becomes a straightforward piece of wisdom. So they're conventionalized in terms of being, as he puts it at one point, prefabricated verbal units, preformulated. They are known and they are loosely fixed. They're fixed as much as their pattern is recognizable. And then they have a semantic content, I should say. They have a meaning behind them that might be ambiguous, that often is ambiguous, and yet it is something that you have heard in some kind of context before. So proverbs are not so much spoken as employed. They are, or invoked, might be just as useful a term. Because if you imagine a situation where you come to me with a concern, or you come to me with a dilemma of some description. Let's just say you are applying for a job. You're applying for a job, the deadline is tomorrow. You're not exactly sure of all the qualifications that are required or what's going to happen, like what the actual sort of hiring process might be. You don't even know if you're necessarily well suited, but you also are in need of employment. So you're hedging the bets. Like, I don't know if this is the right thing for me. What am I going to do? I have to make this decision quickly. And I could say to you, well, he who hesitates is lost. And you go, oh, good point. I should act, shouldn't I? And so I know that there's a deadline, but I will lose this opportunity. Or however you choose to interpret it. I'm not necessarily even providing what I mean when I am employing this proverb. So, he who hesitates is lost. And fundamentally, I'm saying, you know the answer already. Let me remind you of what our culture says in this situation. And then I could easily say the opposite. I could easily say, look before you leap. This is about caution. It's about hesitancy. Or is it? At the very least, it sounds to be about hesitancy and caution. You're like, you're right, I should really find out some more about this before I decide. This isn't something I can do on a whim. And I am using this conventionalized piece of wisdom to remind you of what our culture already says, because we inhabit this culture. And so Proverbs become these, sometimes they're called like little ideas, or they encapsulate units of worldview, folk ideas that are about, they're little orienting principles. They might be conventional descriptions, but often they are about interpretation, how to interpret either a potential course of action or a previous course of action. He points out that in some contexts, Proverbs actually fundamentally substitute for systems of law because they are what the group has said about particular situations. That a mastery of proverb is similar, akin to a mastery of a legal understanding. We have precedent. When in our textual traditions of law, we have case law. We can point, this argument has been settled in this way previously, therefore, judge, this is how you should proceed when we settle this. And that's fundamentally what case law and precedent is. And another lawyer says, yes, but this case is actually closer to what we are saying, and therefore you should settle it in this way. And then judgment is basically taking the arguments for or against a particular course of action. And those arguments are weighted by previous arguments for either side, or previous courses of action, and then the judge is fundamentally the arbiter about, yes, this is more like this situation than it is like that situation, therefore I am impelled in the sense of continuity to do this. It doesn't mean that this is not a legitimate form of inquiry, it's that this is not a legitimate application of that form of inquiry in this particular place. In traditional courts of law, it's often proverbial wisdom that's brought up, not particular judgments, but basically they become battles of proverbs, because proverbs, just like look before you leap and he who hesitates is lost, are often seemingly contradictory. There might be the issue that we have these two different moments, these two different pieces of wisdom within a culture that contradict each other, but they only contradict each other in terms of when they are both invoked simultaneously. And then it isn't a contradiction, it is a resolution about which is the proper course of action. So it's not, we are not bifurcated by having both look before you leap and he who hesitates is lost within our cultural repertoire. that does not mean that our culture is inconsistent. That means that at certain times it is a look before you leap, and at certain times it is a he who hesitates. And it is a matter of when that wisdom is brought in. That is key. So he goes through again. This isn't the most exciting read, but it's just so very thick as it stands. He delves into some of the historical sources. So he is expressly operating from a English language focused perspective and largely a European perspective. He adverts to the literature, but the literature is so vast that you'll see as he writes, he's consistently saying with an emphasis on English language sources, which indicates at the very least then an emphasis on which of the precedents for English language sources he's drawing from. There are international peremiologists who do it in similar places, but they would require an international language, and we are speaking in English right now, and he is writing in English. And so he speaks of the sort of four major sources of proverb, and they all tend to be homogenizing sources. Because the first one he gives is Roman and Greek antiquity, and basically the classics, as it were, which, a literature that became, thanks to power and privilege, became a sort of standard reference point for much of European history, and of course, and elsewhere, because it had influence. It was, it would have been lost were it not adopted and taken in by the Arabic world. During the Middle Ages, or the medieval times, the Dark Ages, is basically the time when Greek and Latin understanding and learning had been lost to Europe. We had language, we had Latin, but we didn't have like the great, many of the great works of the Greeks. But, and then there's the Renaissance, for the rebirth of that classical culture, brought those texts back into being, and this particular moment, or it's not a moment, it's several centuries, but this particular era of writing influenced the Proverbs. It was one of the first, or the earliest influence of Proverbs. The second is, as you might expect, the Old and New Testaments, what fundamentally became the sacred texts of Christianity, which is also infused with proverbial wisdom, up to the point of having, of course, the entire book of Proverbs, a collection, a book that is basically nothing but these units of thought and easily reinvocable statements that are indicative of some pearl of wisdom. The third is medieval Latin, which again was I want to say lingua franca, but was the language the language of court, the language of inquiry, the language of much academic and much vernacular writing. People were writing these, and these were, of course, were all products. It's a harsh word. Were all moments that transcended borders. So it's not that these didn't have. It's not that there weren't local proverbs as well, but it's remarkable how many, because these are leveling, because these are literally international, certainly they're pan-European influences, they permeated throughout these cultures as well, sometimes entering into vernacular translations, and so we'd have similarities of a proverb from moment to moment. So you have the medieval Latin, and then the fourth is this sort of return, where thanks to the homogenization of pop culture, and ironically of American pop culture, which has also become this leveling cross-border reservoir that is able to sort of permeate into the folk speech of the day. So those are sort of the fairly large movements of how these come to be. He has this wonderful idea well, it's not his idea. The notion that there is a Peremiological Minima, and that's actually taken from Grigory Peremiakov, who more or less established that there is this sort of critical mass of proverbs that you need to know, and Peremiakov was talking in the Russian context, that you need to know to be an actually sort of culturally fluent. In that, so I mean, he used empirical methods to try and sort of establish what are the conventional understandings. So in a way, they're talking about how proverbs form this different level of fluency that goes beyond a vocabulary comprised of individual words, and of course a grammar about how those words go together, and becomes this additional level of sort of demonstrating a true fluency, a true understanding of how to operate in that culture, in that linguistic culture. But of course, not all English speakers have the exact same Peremiological minima of proverbs, but you can probably make an argument that there is a peremiological, my God, that's a difficult word to say, peremiological minima of, say, Cape Breton proverbs. And that's what differentiates the come from away from the Cape Bretoner. And so it's not simply a matter of understanding the language, it's really a matter about how to sort of operate within that particular culture. They also change, they adapt over time, they modify, they're good examples of that tension between dynamism and conservatism, because their conventional aspect, like you come across in other conventional forms that have either have a cadence or a set body of symbols associated with them, or a rhythm or a pattern or a meter. So things like ballad, folk song, they are less subject to variation over time, because their recognizability of not simply their semantic context, but the form that semantic context takes is part of the weight of what keeps them within active circulation. Nevertheless, they do adapt. They hop languages. They can just as much as old forms can, or old ideas can still be lodged in proverbial forms that long ago, like the references are gone. Every mickle a muckle. Mickles and muckles aren't a thing nowadays, but the proverb is still in some kind of circulation in some areas. Because they're great sounding words. But they can also adapt over time. But they're lovely, ambiguous statements, and their ambiguity is part of their weight, in that they are subject to some kind of interpretation. As he says, the bottom of page 30, after all, proverbs are not universal truths, but rather limited pieces of folk wisdom that are valid only in certain situations. The problem of contradictory proverbs exists primarily because people ignore their social context. Exactly. So that's reflecting back on things like the he who hesitates is lost, look before you leap dilemma. They're not contradictory, they are contextual. But they're ambiguous, and they are recognizable enough that you kinda know what they mean, but it's that kinda, that fuzziness that surrounds kinda. You can enumerate proverbs, and if you can see that there are an awful lot of proverbs about this kind of thing in a culture, it probably is indicative of that as an important thematic element in a culture. For example, He says the frequent use of proverbs in a particular culture could be used together with other social and cultural indicators to formulate valid generalizations. If the Germans really do use the proverbs, the morning hour has gold in its mouth, which is basically the early bird catches the worm, or order is half of life, with high frequency, then they do mirror, at least to some degree, the German attitude towards setting up early and keeping things in good order. Nevertheless, proverb studies looking for national character traits should be undertaken with much care. So it is interesting how many proverbs might have to do with something. It might be indicative of something. It can't be a proof, but it might be enough circumstantial evidence to sort of push one in one particular direction. He talks a lot about the use of proverbs in politics. That has been one of his areas, and he has written entire books on the proverbs as proverbial use by Churchill, by Obama, by Martin Luther King, by Goering, by Hitler. Because, again, one of the things that the use of proverbs does is not simply making one's speech folkier, which is perhaps an objective in and of itself, but it suggests that the things that are being said are coming from a place of collective understanding, that you already know this. Let me remind you, again, that sort of proverbs as reminders. Let me remind you of what our group already understands about the world by drawing an analogy, by employing this conventional piece of wisdom and demonstrating by analogy that this course of action or this description of events that I am uttering is very much like this other thing. And so it turns things into, for lack of a better word, common sense. It turns a proposal into something that is self-evident. It's self-evident because, hey guy, we're already oriented in this direction. Let me remind you that this is what our group says. So there's a wonderful amount of rhetorical value that can be had in having a mastery of proverbs. And therefore there's a potential danger, there's risk, because it can conventionalize that which should not be conventional. It can normalize that to which normalcy should not be given. I was chairing a panel at AFS this year, and Wolfgang was on it, and he is revisiting Goering's work and Goering's use of proverbs in his own diaries. And there's just been a master critical edition of the complete unabridged Goering diaries, and he's working his way through, and this paper was sort of a work in progress, and just demonstrating how even though Goering was vain and was very you could tell by his writing that he was committed to the idea that one day that these would be public. They were still private writings, and his use of his almost overbearing use of proverbial forms in his justifications to himself of the self-evident righteousness of final solution, of Hitlerian dogma is frightening, and he's convincing himself as a practice to convincing others, and clearly it worked. So there's a danger and a risk involved in thinking. So it's something we can use, and of course they've been employed. Proverbs have not only been employed by mass culture and popular culture. There's often the realm of the antiproverb. An antiproverb is a play. When we use the word anti in folklore studies, it often means something that is not a... sometimes we employ it in terms of almost like parody, in that it is not the thing that is traditional. It is a new statement that is specifically, or new narrative or whatever, that is specifically building on the understanding of the conventionalized thing within the repertoire and subverting it some way. So, for example, he has that list on 43 of the different ad slogans that are come across in popular culture. So an apple a day keeps the doctor away, becomes a condom a day keeps the doctor away. A miss is as good as a mile, becomes a ms is as good as a male. Nobody is perfect becomes no body is perfect. Different strokes for different folks becomes different Volks for different folks in terms of Volkswagen. So they can use this wisdom, this conventional idea. Sometimes they'll just use it outright and they'll apply a proverbial expression to their advertising. And then sometimes they will tweak it in a way that invokes the common sense while also giving that frisson of delight in, oh, okay, I see what you did there. That's very intriguing. So at the very least, it's tickling the aesthetic sense while also suggesting that this is not much of a leap beyond what we already accept as conventional wisdom. That it is at least analogous to the conventional wisdom. And of course, they can be sources of proverbs and proverbial expressions. And pop culture seeps into folk expression. The classic example is "A picture is worth 1,000 words," which is it was a Kodak expression, a piece of advertising copy, and it has since permeated the culture until it's a proverb. There's no argument that it is a proverb. You can, you can make an argument that "Eat, Pray, Love" is a proverb, it being the title of the novel. You could make memoir. You could make an argument that at least the proverbial expression of being voted off the island has entered the lexicon. If the glove don't fit, you must acquit. Johnny Cochran's statement speaking about proverbial wisdom in courtrooms. The self-evident nature of it summarizes that statement and then enters into the culture. They don't necessarily last forever, but then they speak to the issue of how are we defining traditionality. And if you can say that they have been reperformed and re-employed a number of times, at the very least you could potentially indicate some kind of spike. This year, one of the things that, and this is not a pop culture proverb necessarily, but it comes in and out of pop culture so often. This year, I really should write this paper. Maybe I shouldn't release this video until I've laid dibs on this paper. Is the proverb or the proverbial expression of the disease, the cure being worse than the disease, or the remedy being worse than the disease. That is invoked expressly related to the disease itself, but in terms of COVID, but just as much in terms of the economic, the lockdown as being a remedy for spread, and how much that was used in early March and over time. For much of the first half of COVID, you had people using the self-evident, the conventional idea of a remedy being worse than the disease over and over again. Now that proverb has its, you find it in Virgil. You find it entered the English language in the 16th century. And it was always metaphorical. It didn't have to do with disease. In the 16th century, it had to do with its first invocation. See if I can remember. It had to do with an argument that was being made for regularizing English spelling and grammar, and whether calling for that was required that one go and rewrite all the texts. And he says, yeah, that's just foolishness. But we can do this on a go forward basis. And it's been used metaphorically in a whole bunch of systems. And actually, it's even used in and it's used in movie trailers all the time. It's in season 4 of The Crown, where the Queen uses it to talk to Margaret Thatcher about her austerity measures, where she says Thatcher is invoking the idea that there is a sickness and that this is a cure for it, and then the Queen comes back and maybe the cure is worse than the disease. And then she says, like chemotherapy, as if we didn't get it. But anyway, it's a regular occurrence. So pop culture is fluent with Proverbs. Pop culture becomes a place where Proverbs can be drawn from, even if they don't have their original sources in pop culture, but certainly again. And now that I'm thinking of it, with great power comes great responsibility. How much of that Spider-Man proverbial wisdom, the wisdom of Uncle Ben, how much has that entered into the culture in the past 4 years? They have historically been rendered into some kind of concrete form. So there is a history of Proverbs not simply existing in verbal forms, but iconographic. And he doesn't mention it here, but he uses the example of the see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, like the 3 monkeys, and that's a common way of rendering that proverb. So much so that you often will see it. You don't need to have the words associated with it. It's just represented by those monkeys without the words underneath it, which again is a conventional piece of wisdom. What does it mean? You tell me, because it still has that ambiguity. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently in terms of proverb is how memes fundamentally are the same. And if you take a meme like probably a really good example is distracted boyfriend. Well, what you have is you have an image. You have an image that is used and reused. You have an image that indicates something. And from the time of its first employment, and then the time to its second employment, where it's oh, this also applies to this situation, it seems to indicate a general attitude and it seems to invoke a general attitude about what? About distraction, about ignoring the good thing that's with you in favor of something that is fleeting. It's kind of a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, with the boyfriend looking at the 2 in the bush. There's a whole bunch of things that can mean. And again, it's ambiguous, but at least there's an orientation of what it means. And then, through using Barth's term of anchorage, we will often put words over the boyfriend, the girlfriend, and the distraction to indicate something. And by doing so, we are fundamentally using the image in a proverbial way and saying this situation is very much like this thing that we all know, the image of the distracted boyfriend. And then the anchorage, the use of the texts, just hammers that home. It reduces the ambiguity. It's this is more how this thing is like this thing, because you're the boyfriend. This is the girlfriend. This is the other girl. And so the idea of thinking of memes as peremiological, memes particularly in terms of their in their graphic form, because we use meme slovenly, in a slovenly way, I find. Because when we want to talk about the Icon Has cheeseburger, or we want to talk about the gangster baby, or we want to talk about whatever, we'll also talk about meme in terms of ideas or word phrases, and I think it might be good to sort of disentangle. But in terms of the vector image, an established repertoire, which is ongoing and more get added to it all the time, but a repertoire of image that has words then superimposed on it. It is the blending of a proverb and an anchorage aspect to demonstrate how this thing is very much like these other things. And there is something peremiological, I've said it 3 times in a row. I think I got it now. There's something peremiological about memes because they are, it's not that proverbs are no longer a thing, far from it, but this particular kind of meme is doing something equivalent to what Proverbs will do. Because I can then using a meme maker. I mean, it's a digital art form, so it'll require a certain amount of stuff, but easily, quickly, I can make something where I am drawing from our collective understanding and putting it into this situation. So a meme in a comment thread is proverbial. That's fun. So this is an excellent reading. It's difficult to do a summary of what is fundamentally a summary, a state of the art, at least how it was in 2014. Proverbs are always emerging, but Proverbs are remarkably constant, which is the same thing. So I'm going to stop. I encourage you to read all Proverb scholarship. There's so much of it. I encourage you to go into Proverbs. They are fascinating. And people who like ad copy, and I mean, if you want to be cynical, if you want to sort of understand how words can inform sense and meaning, and not simply how words, but how conventional wisdom can orient ourselves, you'd be well served to go into Proverb scholarship, dabble one's toes in it, Wolfgang and others. But I'm going to stop. As ever, my friends, I wish you the best. Bye-bye.